Imagine being shut inside a wooden vessel, sealed from the world, with 7 other people and an untold number of animals for company. Not for a weekend, not for a season, but for 370 days. That is the scene the Bible sets before us in Genesis 6-8. A slender band of human life, a floating ark roughly the length of a soccer field and more than 3 stories tall, set adrift while the world outside is undone. How did Noah and his family endure that year? How did they manage the animals, the hunger, the smells, the darkness, and the waiting? And what did it mean that the Lord himself shut the door? Genesis 7:16. Today we will step inside that ark, following the scriptural landmarks, and imagine, carefully and reverently, the practical and spiritual ways Noah survived 370 days during the Great Flood. The Bible gives us the blueprint. God tells Noah how to build the ark, specifying its proportions in cubits. Genesis 6:14-16. A cubit is roughly the length of a forearm. Using a commonly accepted measure, 300 cubits translates to about 137 meters long, 50 cubits about 23 meters wide, and 30 cubits close to 14 meters high. That makes the ark a huge rectangular box, long and relatively narrow, 3 decks high, an internal volume large enough to house people, provisions, and many animals. Genesis notes a single window, a narrow opening running around the top, about a cubit in height, roughly 45 centimeters. It also makes clear there were 3 internal levels, lower, second, third. Genesis 6:16. These details give us a starting point to imagine scale and layout, and they raise immediate practical questions. How did the family secure light and air with only a narrow perimeter opening? Where were the animals housed? How was food arranged and preserved? Importantly, the scripture itself frames some of the answers. God commanded the gathering of food for Noah and the animals, Genesis 6:21, and he provided the command and the protection, even as Noah carried out the labor. If this account stirs something in you, if the thought of God providing in the midst of impossibility gives you hope, drop a single word in the comments. He cares for me. To step inside in our minds, picture the 3 decks as distinct working zones. The lowest deck plausibly housed larger, heavier animals and bulk storage. The middle deck was likely where many of the smaller animals and food stores were kept. The upper deck would have been living space for the family, and perhaps areas for lighter provisions, kitchens, and places where animals and humans could be kept somewhat separated. The single narrow window at the top would admit strip-like shafts of daylight across the upper level, but would do little to brighten the lower decks. Ventilation through that opening and any other gaps would be limited. The air inside an enclosed wooden ark, with animals and humans and food stores, would quickly become heavy and humid. Genesis tells us the window was to a cubit high. That precise detail presses us to confront the reality. Light and air were not luxuries. They were limited resources that had to be managed. The sensory picture deserves a moment of sober attention. Imagine dawn light spilling in as a thin ribbon, illuminating dust motes and spiderwebs in the rafters. Hear the lowing and bleating, the occasional cough or snort, the shuffling of hooves against planks. Smells, a constant complex mixture, straw and hay, damp wood, animal fur, hides, and the pungency of waste. Noise never wholly ceased. Even at night there were rustles and sighs as creatures shifted, and people muttered schedules and prayers. Yet Genesis insists on order amid these pressures. Animals came in by God's command and entered as instructed, and once aboard, they remained. The Lord shut the ark's door, Genesis 7:16, placing the family under an enforced shelter and making the timing of their leaving dependent on him alone. That divine closure is both practical and theological. It ended the chance of human interference with God's judgment and underscored dependence on his timing for restoration. The logistical problems are enormous once you start listing them. Feeding, both people and animals, is foremost. Genesis 6:21 records God's instruction to Noah to gather of every food. Hebrew sometimes represented as machau, indicating provisions. The text does not itemize everything, but the likely staples are evident from ancient Near Eastern diets, and what would store well: grains, dried fruits, nuts, legumes, preserved roots, and fodder like hay and dried grasses for herbivores. Animals brought their own feeding needs. Some required fresh grazing, others could subsist on stored fodder. Clean animals were to be taken by sevens, 7 pairs according to Genesis 7:2, for sacrificial and ritual purposes, while other animals came in pairs. Those distinctions required Noah to sort and house animals with intentionality. How much food? Scripture does not provide tonnage or exact measures. Any calculation is a reconstruction. Scholars and logisticians can offer plausible estimates, suggesting that Noah stockpiled large quantities of durable staples and concentrated fodder. It is reasonable to propose that the family focused on foods that did not spoil quickly and that could be rationed. Dried grains kept whole rather than ground into flour that would attract pests. Salted or dried meats and fish where possible. Nuts and legumes in sealed stores. Dried fruits, dates and figs have long shelf life in warm climates. For animal fodder, hay and straw compressed into bales could serve for many months. These are plausible scenarios, not biblical assertions. The point is that sensible pre-flood preparation, guided by God's command, was essential. Noah's obedience in gathering supplies was a human response to a divine directive. Preservation without refrigeration required ancient techniques: drying, salting, smoking, and airtight containment. Grain and legumes can last long if kept dry. Oil and vinegar can act as preservatives. Salt can cure meat. Smoke and sun-drying remove moisture. Again, we must be cautious about certainty. The Bible names the command to collect food, but the methods are reconstructions based on what was practiced historically. Labeling these as plausible helps us appreciate the human work that accompanied divine provision. Feeding schedules and rationing would have been crucial. Imagine morning and evening feeding rounds, chore lists pinned by memory or scratched onto simple wooden slates. Lower deck, distribute hay to the oxen and camels. Middle deck, deliver grain mash to smaller animals at midday. Upper deck, prepare family meals and manage leftovers. The 8 human inhabitants, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, formed a compact workforce. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as a righteous and blameless man in his generation, a description that implies leadership qualities, steady faith, disciplined labor, and moral authority. In practice, leadership would mean coordination, conflict resolution, and the distribution of labor. Family dynamics under confinement are a dimension often overlooked. 8 adults in a 3-deck wooden box for more than a year required order, roles, and emotional resilience. Noah, as patriarch, likely oversaw overall strategy and devotion. His sons may have taken principal responsibility for animal care, feeding, cleaning stalls, moving beasts as necessary, while the wives managed domestic provisioning, food preparation, and sanitation systems for the human quarters. Sanitation itself required attention, designated spots for waste collection, burials or composting, and frequent cleaning in animal areas to limit disease. A plausible setup would include layered straw bedding that could be replaced or aired where possible, and routine designated for waste removal into sealed bins or chambered areas that could be later discarded overboard when the waters permitted. Again, these are reasonable reconstructions intended to bring the ancient text to practical life. They are not claims that Genesis specifies every domestic detail. A key theological element is that while Noah did the work, God provided conditions that made that work possible. The animals came to Noah by God's direction, Genesis 6:27-9, and entered so that predation was suspended. The biblical narrative does not describe the mechanics. It affirms that order prevailed by God's will. That intervention is essential to the story. This was not merely a naturalistic barn raising. Predators who might otherwise hunt prey were restrained. A supernatural peace ordered by the Creator. Theologically, this serves to underline God's sovereignty and care even within judgment. It also brought Noah the practical possibility of housing mixed species without catastrophe. The discipline of animals in close quarters required more than mere feeding. Housing had to be organized, predators separated from prey, except where the peace of God held, animals grouped by size and temperament to minimize stress, and bedding and light managed to reduce injury. Some animals might have been tethered or kept in stalls. Others could have moved within larger pens. Moisture control mattered. Damp straw breeds rot and disease, so drying and rotation schemes would matter. The family's work in maintaining hygiene would have been relentless and exhausting. These details point again to a simple truth. Obedience was not passive. Noah was called to active, constant care. Time itself became a test. The rain began and lasted 40 days and nights, Genesis 7:12, but the waters that covered the earth continued for much longer. Genesis notes that the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days, Genesis 7:24. Then, over months, the waters receded until the ark came to rest, and eventually the land dried. If one follows the internal chronology in Genesis, from the day Noah entered the ark to the day the dry land appeared and the family disembarked, the total period commonly calculated arrives at roughly 370 days. For our purposes today, we take 370 days as the time frame the title names, understanding that this number emerges from the unfolding timeline in Genesis. Living that long under a divine timetable required patience and spiritual discipline. The narrative of testing that leads to the exit is one of the most vivid episodes of patient discernment. After the rain subsided, Noah waited until the waters lessened and then tested the outside with birds. Genesis 8:6-12 tells of the sending of a raven, which flew back and forth until the waters dried. Then a dove that first returned to the ark, then returned with an olive leaf, and finally did not return. The sequence is wise and measured. The raven's behavior suggested that there were carcasses or open water to sustain scavengers. The dove's eventual return with a leaf signaled the emergence of vegetation. When the dove finally did not come back, Noah had the sign he sought. This testing shows cautious leadership. Noah did not rush the exit. He sought evidence of habitability and proceeded only when God's timing became clear. The moment when the Lord shut the door, Genesis 7:16, and later when Noah opened the door to leave, carries theological weight. God's closure emphasized his sovereignty over the judgment, and his later provision allowed for the recreation of human life on earth. When the family finally disembarked, Noah's first act was worship. He built an altar and sacrificed clean animals and offerings to the Lord, Genesis 8:20. That altar marks the transition from survival to gratitude, from preservation to new beginnings. It prefigures the idea that deliverance leads to worship and covenant renewal. God's response, a pledge that he would never again curse the ground or destroy all living creatures by a flood, points toward a restored relationship with creation. From this story we can draw several practical theological lessons. First, divine provision and human responsibility move together. The ark narrative places both claims side by side. God commands and protects. Noah prepares, works, and obeys. Faith without action would have been insufficient, Equally, human effort without God's protection would have been only temporary. This teaches a posture of trust in action, obedience that is active, not passive, and dependence that is humble, not self-sufficient. Second, leadership in crisis is disciplined, patient, and orderly. Noah's role required him to plan, to assign tasks, to manage stress, and to maintain spiritual focus. Leadership under pressure includes maintaining hope, setting routines, and modeling calm. For contemporary listeners who face long seasons of waiting or confinement, whether illness, loss, or any sustained trial, Noah's steady stewardship offers a pattern. Prepare faithfully, serve others faithfully, and wait on God's timing. Third, patience in discernment matters. Noah did not open the ark at the first sign, or when he was tired of waiting. He tested, observed, and waited for signs that the land could sustain life again. That measured waiting is a spiritual discipline. It resists impulsive exits and insists on prudence informed by signs God provides. Fourth, restoration invites worship and gratitude. The altar Noah built is not an afterthought. It is a theological response to rescue. Surviving is not only about returning to routine, it is about recognizing God's hand and responding in worship and renewed fidelity. It is important to emphasize what the biblical text does not attempt to do. Genesis is not a technical manual of animal husbandry or an inflexible inventory of species. It is a theological narrative framing God's dealings with humanity. When we fill in practical details about feeding, housing, and sanitation, we do so to help understand the human dimension of obedience. We label such reconstructions as plausible scenarios, informed by historical practice and common sense, rather than as Scripture itself. Two final practical reflections for the listener today. First, seasons of confinement, whether literal or figurative, test our capacity to trust and to serve. Noah was not passive during the flood. He worked ceaselessly within the ark. In your own season of waiting, ask, what faithful work can I do now? What preparations of the heart and home might I make that will matter when the waiting is over? Second, God's timing may close doors we would rather keep open. The Lord closed the ark so that the flood could run its course. God's closures in our lives may not be arbitrary, but protective and purposeful. Waiting on Him often means relinquishing control and trusting that He will reopen what He intends to restore. When the day finally came, when the dove did not return and the ground was proven, Noah and his household stepped out into a cleansed yet altered world. His first act was sacrificial worship, Genesis 8:20, a posture of gratitude and recognition that the life they stepped into was a gift, not merely their own cleverness. The covenantal echoes that follow the flood point to God's enduring commitment to creation and to His desire for human fidelity. How, then, did Noah survive 370 days inside the ark? In summary, by the conjunction of divine providence and human obedience. The ark's size and internal organization made survival physically possible. Noah's preparedness, gathering provisions, machau, in response to God's command, provided the raw material. Practical household order and division of labor sustained daily life. And most profoundly, God's intervention ordered animal behavior, sealed the ark at the appointed time, and opened the way to exit when He judged it right. Survival was never merely a human achievement. It was the fruit of an intimate collaboration between obedient servants and a sovereign God. As you leave this reflection, consider what in your life feels like an ark, a confined space, a season of waiting, a situation you did not choose but must endure. What preparations, practical, spiritual, relational, has God invited you to make? Where might you imitate Noah's quiet labor, his steady leadership, and his patient testing of God's signs? The story is not an ancient puzzle to be solved only by scholars. It is a living example of what faith looks like when crisis meets obedience. If this exploration encouraged you, please like and subscribe for more careful readings of Scripture and faithful reflections. And take a moment now. What area of your life are you waiting patiently for God to open? Share one short sentence below so we can pray and learn together.